All right, chapter 10, moving right along with our readings and presentations for the week. Chapter 10 is on rigor and validity in quantitative research, and you'll probably hear so much about rigor and validity throughout to realize that it is one of the most important concepts when we talk about research, because you don't want to use something that you don't think is going to have any reason to think that it will work. So, you really do want to look for things that have been truly tested in a good manner, which is why, critiquing research is going to be what we're going to be coming up doing next as far as some of the assignments go, to really get you into the literature, immerse yourself into it, to really tell what is a really good study, and what's not. Again, there's no absolutes with anything, as we've already said in the last chapter, if you had listened to that, which I hope you did. Validity is the approximate truth of the inference that you're making from your study. You look at it and you say, nothing's 100% true, but this is a greatest approximation that we can get to. You want to try to diminish as many threats to the validity that you can, because those threats are reasons that an inference, could be wrong. So it's a property, that has degrees as far as, again, not being an absolute. Threats to validity are reasons, that cause that to be for us to make errors in doing research, and why you shouldn't just go on one research study, that you really need to see that things have been repetitively studied, or you look at the type of study that it has large enough numbers of participants in it, so that it's going to have a really high rating, that the inferences that are drawn from it can be given the truth value to it. Okay, so you want to have a strengthen that inference that is being made. So some of the types of validity we're going to look at are statistical conclusion and internal validity and construct validity and, external validity. So I guess I just moved right by that. Let me go back to that slide. Okay, types of validity. So the first type of statistical conclusion validity concerns the validity of inferences that these truly is an empirical relationship, meaning that, it's scientifically proven, or it is a correlation that is between the presumed cause and effect. So again, it's not 100%, but you are assuming that it is true. The researcher's job, or your job if you're doing the research, is to provide the strongest possible evidence that the relationship is real, and that the intervention was given a fair test to make sure, that it is what is giving you the results that you are getting, and that there aren't any other variables that can be compounding it or interfering, or maybe are responsible for the effect that you're getting. Your internal validity, concerns the validity of the inference, giving that you have an independent variable, and that is what is causing the outcome. Okay, so that no other variables are interfering. And again, it is our job to develop the strategies that, we can be testing for the independent variable, and that we are controlled for those other variables when we're looking for our observed, relationship. Construct validity involves the validity of inferences, from the observed persons, settings, and cause and effect operations included in the study, when you're looking at those construct that those instances might represent. So you're looking for, is it really measuring what you want it to measure? Because there's your construct that can be a little abstract, so you have to know, when you're developing tools or finding tools to take measurements, that they really are a good representation of that construct, that has been theorized. Okay, so if you're looking and you believe in something because, of the theory, like number of nurses on staff increase or decrease the amount of patient falls on the shift or something, like that, you're making, inferences, and but what do you mean by number of nurses? And what, does it matter how many patients there are? Does it matter the acuity levels? What other variables, can be affected in there? What is the education of the nurses? So that's the kind of thing, is you really want to make sure that the construct that you're measuring, you're not getting other things in there that are interfering with the measurement of the actual point of it, your phenomenon that you're of interest that you're looking at. And then external validity concerns whether inferences about those relationships will hold over variations in person, setting, time, or measures of the outcome. So can you take these results and then generalize them to, a bigger group of people? Or is it just really the people that work on that unit that you could actually say this is true for, that if you took it, you couldn't even do it to another unit in that hospital because there's too many variables that could have been interfering, that it really wouldn't be generalizable. That's why getting a great representation, from the population that you want to be examining is the best, so that you can say this really is a good represent of this whole aggregate population of, say, nursing staff or patients or whatever the group is that you're looking at, that you could then generalize it to, you know, a different situation or perhaps even a different context if you can find enough consistencies and a good validity with your study. So always looking at validity and reliability as you're reading the studies, to see what it is that they're doing to make you believe in what they're doing, what their research is good. So how do we control, for those sources that can confound, the validity by adding confounding variables or things that we weren't expecting to find? One of the best ways is that randomization or crossovers where you use, the same groups as your control and your study groups, so that you really know all the variables that you're dealing with within the population or your sample population. Homogeneity, that there aren't many variables. So like say if you're using, all girls from this one class, or even if you're doing a patient diagnosis, that you're really cutting down on the variables so that you're looking at a really specific group that aren't going to have a lot of variations. Stratification and blocking is so that if you do notice that there is certain variables that you do want to control for, that you can do stratifying and blocking to make sure that there's an equal representation, in both groups. Or you can do, matching for each person in a, you pick for the experimental group, that you then match somebody with those variables into the control group. So that's what you're really looking at in that respect. See, and statistical control, you really, it's more like you're looking at different variables that you may want to look at and see how much of an impact they are making, if you think these confounding variables, can really affect your outcome. And these are where we're going to get into your higher level tests, which would be an analysis of covariance, or it's also called an ANCOVA. And I'll give you an example by showing you this next. So say, age is one of the things that, can vary in your groups, and the participation in the program, and maybe you're looking at, the resting heart rate as your dependent variable. So say it's like an exercise program. Well, if you have 50-year-olds exercising, if your age range of your participants was 50 to 80, there's going to be big variance based on that age in your dependent variable. So that's something you may want to control for, because you're not going to know if it's the participation in the program that's making the difference, or if it's the age of that participant. So you may want to control for that variable by, decreasing the range of patients that you do check. So if you control it from age, you get a more accurate estimate of the effect of the program on the heart rate, because that's what you're studying. Okay, otherwise, how will you know what percent of the heart rate changes based on age versus what is based on, the participate in the program? So that's just like a really important factor to look at. So again, do we need to modify them? Maybe we need to look at, do studies with 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds, 70-year-olds, and then of course you can compare the results based on age. But you really, if you want to see the effect of the independent variables, sometimes those are the kinds of things that you do want to check for. So some of the programs, if you leave age in, you can run a ANCOVA, which will actually give you covariance and would tell you this much is based on age, because they'll look at all the ages and see what their resting heart rate is, and then kind of say, well, based on this age group, you're only finding a difference of X amount, so it's most likely the age. And they'll actually break it down into percentages of what they're saying is based on, the age factor. So again, we can control for it if we know to expect it. And that's the thing, is if you have a variable that you can expect that's going to have an outcome, and you can find out that by looking at different studies they've done in the past, doing a literature review, then, those are the things that do have to be, factored in as far as that goes. So 4 types of validity that affect the rigor of that study. We're going to discuss each one of these, separately. So statistical conclusion validity, you want to get the largest sample size that you can to get your highest statistical power. So if, you're worrying about, if you only have 10 people that you're going to be testing on, then you're not getting a high statistical power whatsoever, because when you think of statistics, it is really based on numbers. Excuse me, and numbers are the most important thing, and the larger the number, the higher your statistical, power will be. So one way to, get that is to get those higher numbers, because, the best way when you're using small samples, you're going to get low statistical power. So then you may want to, consider other things as far as picking out your sampling group. If you're not getting a large enough sample, that you may want to see, well, I may not get a large enough sample, but if I really think that this effect is powerful, then, I'll do small, more studies of smaller groups. But when you look at the overwhelming same conclusions after test with the smaller groups, then you can that's kind of a chi-square test. When you do that, you kind of look at what the findings are of similar tests of the variables, and you find out they consistently get the same results. That's what helps with that. So just real important to look at that. And then restriction of range, you have to worry about, if you make it too small, are you really going to get representative samples? So be careful. It does lessen the generalizability, of your testing. And, unreliable implementation of a treatment, of course, well, intervention infidelity is what that would be considered, because, everything, it needs to be standardized. So whoever's, implementing the treatment has to be doing it the same way everybody else is. So the training that goes into it, that they're following the same exact policy and procedure, and that if it's something that the patients, you give them the directions and take it on their own, are they taking it as described? Because that could give you, some variables that you weren't counting on if they are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, as part of the study. Your internal validity is another big factor, and that's the extent to which it is possible to make an inference that the independent variable, rather than any other factor, is really causing that variation, in the dependent variable. Because sometimes, if it's quasi-experimental or correlation, you don't have a direct study, you're not always sure, that there couldn't be other variables that are in there, because you didn't have your randomization. Maybe your numbers aren't really big enough. So some of the threats, would be with temporal ambiguity. You have a cause, that must precede the effect. So again, that's not an issue in your random control trials, but it can be in correlational studies when you just have 2 variables and you really weren't sure, was it the chicken or the egg first? So that would be of concern. When you're doing your selection of participants, you have to worry that you have non-equivalent groups, so that the difference could be from the group differences, like you have, too many of one variable that you weren't accounting for in one group that is actually skewing what your results should be. So again, it's identifying those variables so that you can, make an effort to try to identify them, and by using further higher level tests like an ANCOVA, get rid of that and know that, well, that would cause for this percentage of the effect. Okay, so that's important. And, also what's going on at the time, what external events are occurring or preceding the data collection, that could be affecting your variables. And that, because people are going to be, out there in the world watching, and if something happened that totally affected their whole perception. They may not be able to give their 100% if there's been something even in their life when they're doing a test that can, make their responses, be different. Is it a fact of that, or is it a fact of, um, the independent variable? Maturation changes occur over a function of time, and sometimes these research studies take a lot of time to get done. And again, like say you're doing premenstrual of 10-year-old girls or something, and you want to do some activities to see the responses to, and then all of a sudden, it's taken so long, everybody starts getting their period, so then they kind of matured out of the study. That's what that kind of means. And mortality, basically people drop out. Hopefully they don't. It means more attrition, but again, depending on what your study is, you could have people that drop out because, they're no longer, with us. So again, research takes time, and these things then are going to affect your numbers. And again, you have to look at what variables are affecting different things. And testing and instrumentation, the effect of taking a pre-test on the performance on the post-test. So again, people kind of know what that pre-test information was and kind of gear their performance on the post-test based on that. And again, difference in the administration and the attitude of the takers. I mean, you can give some of those standardized tests in schools, and the kids just go down and do a pattern instead of really, reading the questions, because they're just not interested in that material, or, or that type of testing that's going on. So those things are really going to affect the validity, of your instruments. Construct validity concerns the inferences from the particular exemplars of a study to the higher order constructs that they are intended to represent. Okay, remember, those higher order constructs are more abstract in terminology. So when you pick something that you're going to measure, like say it's emotions, and you want to find out how caring, is affected by level of emotions, then one of the ways you're going to do it is by some kind of scale or emotional testing. And you really want to make sure that the questions on that test are really giving, validating the kinds of behaviors that you may be looking for. So really choosing that measurement of that construct is going to be really important, between the, what you're conceptualizing and then the information, that you're really getting. So that you have to make sure you are measuring what that independent variable, that intervention, what is it really doing, with the manipulation, to the treatment group. So is it really looking at that construct that you are looking at to make that change on that dependent variable, that they really do have to have a strong correspondence, to each other. Again, if it's non-experimental research, you're not really creating and manipulating, the cause. So it is even harder to ensure construct validity of the independent variable, is there. So you have to truly look at what other variables can be interfering with, your study to get as much construct validity. It really is, are you measuring what you want to be measuring? Or somehow is it picking up other things because the tool may not be good, or the way people interpret it is too varied. You're getting too much variability in that respect. So threats, reactivity to the study situations, we kind of just talked about these. Researcher expectancies, a lot of times we read into things because it's what we expect to see rather than what we're really seeing. The novelty effects of something that's, new, can change the reactions that you're getting from different people. Compensatory effects, you get, if people know whether they're in the control group or the experimental group, they can kind of try to compensate for their lack of getting the treatment in their own way. And then treatment diffusion, control gets similar service elsewhere, or they drop out. So if you're doing, the effective massage and your control group goes off and gets their own massages because they feel left out, well, then when you go to measure them with whatever it is that you're measuring them with, the treatment would have been diffused into the control group. So it's going to really mess up the results. External validity, concerns inferences about the extent to which relationships observed in a study hold true over variations in people's conditions and settings, as well over variations in treatments, and outcomes. So what are those external factors, that can met? Can you, do you have a good enough representativeness of your sampling? And could you replicate it in different, groups that you can look at, um, what could be done based on different groups if you're going to get the same type of relationships, when you do replicate studies across time and across space and across people and across settings. So looking at how different studies of the same type of variables were done in different contexts, what can you infer from that as far as again, the generalization, which is basically what your external validity is looking at, is can you take what you're finding and assume you're going to find it in others if they receive the same treatment. And some of the threats, it could be interaction between relationships and people. Again, we are human. You may get an effect observed with certain types of people that may not be observed with other types. A common complaint about using some of the randomized control tests is that many people are excluded not because they wouldn't benefit from the treatment, but rather they, can't really provide the needed data. They could be cognitively impaired, or they could not speak, English. They don't have transportation for the research, the administration of the treatments. So again, when you look at the history of research, they used to do it on mostly your healthy white males. A lot of times it was convenience, and that's how they set it up. But now we're realizing that it's not giving us enough data that we can, really generalize it to different populations because of the physiological factors that differ. Even cultures, we know that different cultures' metabolisms are different in certain things. Interaction between causal effects and treatment variation. Well, an innovative treatment might be effective if it's paired with other elements, but sometimes those elements are intangible. If you have an enthusiastic and dedicated director of this research and, they're going around and, oh, this is wonderful, this is great, oh, we're going to find out so many things, blah, blah. But if we can't, the next person who does the study has a real blah, no personality director, there could have been effects on, different people's attitudes and how they're going to respond to subsequent tests. So just different things. Can it be truly, replicated 100%, or are there going to be some variations? So you have to, trade off some priorities instead of validity. If you can improve your internal validity without harming your external validity, you know, and both are very important that are, to build an evidence base. But sometimes, prioritization and makes you want to change maybe some design, or there's some design flaws that are there that you want to go back and work on and check on and change. And those are the kinds of notes you need to be taking. And of course, those would be what you would report in the research report. Things to do done differently, threats that you found out after the study was done, but that you still, had certain truth value to what you were finding, but but people needed to understand this is, also what occurred, and take it from how they see the value in it. And here's some of those questions. Keep planning questions when you're doing something, looking at some of the research out there, or planning your research, I should say. How can I reach those who need the intervention? How can I design the intervention to persuade those who need to try it? Finding participants can be very, very difficult. A lot of times, especially if you're trying to do it with students or, patients, they don't want to be bothered. People's lives are so busy. They don't want to really participate in, research studies. Even at big research universities, you have to get everybody's permission. Excuse me, if they're not going to participate, then doesn't matter. You can't make them. You cannot force them. So here's some of those guidelines for critiquing some of those elements. You can just, they're in your book as far as looking what study designs and rules they are, what threats were noted to the internal validity. If they didn't notice any threats, but you're critiquing the article and you think of something that they should have thought of, that's something that you want to note down. Also, of why you may not have truth value in believing what that research is telling you. Okay, so that was the second lesson on this week's. So take a break. Let your soul rest for some time, because we do have some more to go. They're shorter, But again, you may want to listen to a couple of these a few times. I have static PowerPoints, again, that go along with these video ones that you can take notes, because there will be, test questions and essays, to test this material on. All right, have a great break.